Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to the Holland Land Office Museum for the next edition of our guest speaker series. Very happy to welcome back Mr. Randy John for a second time, all the way up from Salamanca. He braved the weather to join us today. He's here to talk about the Oil Springs territory, and we're very happy to have him back. I want to thank Tompkins Community Bank and Batavia Rotary Club for again sponsoring the guest speaker and concert series this year, as well as GoArt as we received a grant from the Regrant Program. So I'll just read this before we begin. I would like to acknowledge GoArt's support of this project. GoArt recognizes that this gathering takes place on the ancestral lands of the Seneca Nation, part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and acknowledges their enduring presence in this region. I guess it's pretty appropriate for today's topic. Leads it perfectly. Can you take it away?
We say, now is now a wake-up, means I'm thankful you are well. Ni garçon net hombres. In Seneca, that means my name is net hombres, that's my Seneca name. I'm from the Allegheny territory, and this is actually the third time I've done this presentation. I pretty much retired after the last time I was here. Came out of retirement for that presentation. So, trying to retire again, but one more before retire. So this is about the Oil Springs territory in Cuba, New York, and it has a really interesting history. It's a very small 1 acre piece of land, and I consider it a microcosm of Native relations with Europeans and the United States. This one little acre has gone through all the different challenges and trials and tribulations and legalities and tests of ownership that we endured and other Native nations have endured. It's a small little piece, but it's gone. So,
did you say 1 acre?
1 acre, 1 square acre. In our traditional beliefs, we tend to be more environmental historically, and crude oil, is part of that. It's part of the connection. And the world has changed a lot, and we all could be a little more aware of Mother's resources. Human beings become quite exploitive. We've done a lot of things. We've changed Mother Earth quite a bit. And certainly oil has gone through the gamut. So when Europeans first came over and the French missionaries heard about oil, and they wrote back to Europe about it, wasn't what it was today. So I'll share some thoughts after our talk. It wasn't about economy, money. The first phase, and I say there's 3 phases. The first phase of interaction between Europeans or Euro-Americans and the Senecas. Oil was a cultural and medicinal item of value. It was used to treat rheumatism, ulcers. Now, may not have been the best solution, but at the time, that was something that was used. It transformed into be used for illumination, lamps, later turned into an economic asset. But the Senecas used it for illumination, night fishing, and they used it for health reasons. Let me share the three phases. The first one I'm talking about is the historic, cultural, medicinal value. Let me be clear that we don't use oil anymore for arthritis. Okay, I don't go, we have a clinic, and I don't go to the clinic, and my wife has arthritis, but I don't yet. But have some things going on there, but they're not giving me oil, okay? All right? The second phase becomes the battle over land. Of course, it's an old topic, but this territory experienced that, of course. And the third phase I'm going to talk about is sovereignty, Seneca sovereignty. It's interesting that you grew up in an area. When I went to college and I met people from many places, you think it's unreal, but it's real. I had people ask me, are Indians real? Are still Indians alive? Because many people don't live where natives are still, have their own land or their own culture or so on, because of the way the land grab went and movement out west and removal of native nations from the east. So, it's not illogical, but to us it is. Because you live in territory that's close by native people. Actually, I don't know a lot about, I know Tonawondas, I don't know a lot about Tonawanda Reservation. I do know a lot about the territory, but, I've never been there, I have friends there, I'm not really an expert on Tonawanda. I spent most of my life at Allegheny. I spent like 10 years off of the territory, and I was out in the universities getting an education. Spent some years in Alfred, about 7 years in Syracuse, lived in New Haven, Connecticut, and I came back home to the territory. Well, I used to work at Bonaventure for 20 years, taught in the sociology department. Then I went into business, and then I worked for the nation. And then I had some health issues, and I haven't worked in a while, and the moment I was a bit homebound, I started writing books. 30 years I collected information, everything I could, didn't have time to write, or I didn't make time to write, had family, had a life outside of academia, or running a business, or working for the Seneca Nation, right? So, once I became homebound, I started writing all these books. And it's kind of been, I guess, probably my destiny, believe it or not. It's like my third life, it's not something, when I was 19, I decided I'm going to go out and write books, and I'll be out lecturing about the Seneca Nation. I was all about learning myself, and I wasn't born with all the knowledge, anyways, so these are the three phases. We're going to go through some of the historical stuff. Now, I have a lot of that listed in your book. You'll be able to go through that. The book's kind of a chronology, so it's kind of easy to read, and you can see the phases. So the French missionary, Father Delaroche d'Aillon, 1627, he heard about Seneca oil. What was likely Seneca oil. Doesn't mean that's the first oil that ever existed. Just means this is the first European that wrote about it, and it's still around. It's been perpetuated in academia. He described it as a good kind of oil, which the Indians called anandantans, and like I said, likely from the Oil Springs territory. The French call it the fountain de Tume. That's 1627. 130 years later, we see Europeans who now moved into the second stage. They're purchasing oil. They're reselling it. They're selling it as a home remedy, like it began. They're selling it for lamp oil. They're taking it to markets on the East Coast. So the Seneca Nation is moving into, the Seneca people are moving into a capitalist type of system. Not just bartering, right? So they're selling oil. 1767, there was an important treaty relationship with the British, and the Seneca leader from Canada brought a gift to the most powerful British soldier in the called a curious oil. They spelled it OYL in the records. This is a gift exchange, and there was always gift exchanges in these treaties. This illustrates the importance, the cultural importance of oil. Now, it's kind of a difficult thing to understand at times. If you were born this century or middle of last century, you don't think of oil as a cultural thing. You think of it as a commodity. Oil makes gas, oil makes other things, right? We need it for our cars. You're seeing that today, right? A little discussion in the papers about that. That stuff's going on. So back then, it was a very important gift. When we moved to 1794, the Pickering Treaty, this is a treaty of peace between the Haudenosaunee, in particular the Senecas, with the newly formed United States. Oil Spring is listed as a territory. You know, it's part of the land that's still considered ours. A few years later, this is the big treaty. This is what opened up western New York. Treaty of Big Treaty, 1797, 3.5 million acres, purchased by Robert Morris. And if you know any of the history, he was in house prison, so his son Thomas actually negotiated the treaty for him. And they sold it to the Holland Land Company. Right. So what the Holland Land Company did then is start selling these parcels. All these parcels to all the lands became all these communities in western New York. So I'm kind of in that setting of that history. 200,000 acres were reserved for the Senecas. At this treaty, our spiritual leader, Hanson Lake, he's a person who kind of revitalized our spiritual belief system. He advocated to keep the Oil Spring territory for its spiritual and cultural value. In fact, he insisted. And it did happen. However, when the machinery of the paperwork for the 1797 Treaty of Big Tree was finalized, there was an omission. The Oil Spring territory was not listed, okay? So this caused a big problem, and the Senecas were going to cancel the treaty if it wasn't included. So in 1801, Joseph Ellicott and the Holland Land Company created a deed for the Oil Spring territory. They corrected this. They made a correction. I've never seen it. I'm not sure if it's something that exists today on paper. And there was a piece of paper that was written to Hanson Lake, given to Hanson Lake, saying, yes, this is yours, whatever the words we use. And I'm sure that's disappeared long ago. I've never heard of anybody seeing it. So this is corrected in 1801. However, the maps still didn't have the official maps, the final maps, did not have the Oil Spring territory on it. Not until 1804. And you have a map in the back room there that shows the Oil Spring territory. I'm not sure what year that was. I just I was shown. I asked Brian about it, he took me out there, and I seen it. So I'm going to go around the corner and look at it. So 1804, it's now laid out in I guess American legal form on the map, in the records, somehow, some way, some form. I've seen a different map too, maybe more in the state records, and it has kind of it's more of a surveyor's map. And the surveyor's map actually shows the Oil Spring territory. But that's 1804, not until 1804. So it took 7 years for that to occur. Okay, so now we're in this land grant era. The original map, the Eden map from the Holland Land Company, was given to Hanson Lake, and he died in 1850. His nephew Governor Blacksnake inherited the map, and he kept this map. That's, the record of the 1804, fixing the error, and he became the protector of that until his death in the 1850s. In 1838, Western New York was sparsely populated. Holland Land Company, again, became the vehicle to create these communities. All these communities I drove through the area, about 2 hours, come through all of these. And I look at them, I think about it, and I look at their names, and I think of some of the names, it's kind of interesting. Some things I recognize, some of the other ones I'm thinking, what community moved here? Is Johnsonburg a German territory, town, community? Because anything Berg, I think, is German. Where Germans came over. So it's kind of my guess. But anyways, I spent time thinking about that on the way up here. You can think of this time by 1838. This is an era for Native people, let alone the Iroquois or Haudenosaunee. Everyone's after our land because it's growth of a nation, right? Well, in 1838, you may or may not know about the illegal Buffalo Creek Treaty. And that treaty took all of our lands in New York. We lost everything. It wasn't just a fight for this little 1 acre. Tonawanda, Buffalo Creek, Cattaraugus, Allegheny. Right? But by the time we got there, most of the villages that were in the Genesee Valley had been sold up in the 1820s. And there's still an illegal treaty in the 1820s, Buffalo Creek Treaty, that, well, we like to think it hasn't been completely addressed. Again, for a treaty to be legal in American law, a federal official needs to be there. And the Senate has to approve it, the United States. That's American law, that's not Indian law. So, and you say you stole our land, it was illegal, it's not just our viewpoint, it's the law of the United States. So there were many treaties that were illegal, not just the Senecas. I don't know all the treaties of the world that are illegal, but this is where we were. So 1838, we threw our Oil Springs out there. We did cling on to that. We did fight for that, but in the bigger picture, we lost everything. And you probably know that 1842, or if you don't, 1842, they had a compromise treaty. Quakers came in and had some other advocates come in. And we were returned the Allegheny and Cattaraugus territory. We lost Buffalo. Why would we lose Buffalo?
It's a harbor.
Economy. It's important to the economy and the growth. And we lost Tonawanda. Now, Tonawanda, the Senecas didn't leave. So from 1842 to 1858, 57, ruling 58, that era, for about 16 years, they stayed there and they fought. And according to the legal treaty now, 1842, right? This compromise treaty that came about, and that's when we got back. They stayed and they fought. And this story is a good story too, because in the late 1850s, they fought and they were able to get their land back. Now, it was a little complicated how they got their land back. It wasn't exactly a state treaty that says, okay, we stole it, you get it back, right? They were allowed to purchase it back with some of the monies they were given to move out west, because that was the deal of the 1838 treaty. Okay, we're going to buy your land, we're going to give you land out west, in Indian country. So they did not get back all of their land. It wasn't the full portion. Certainly some of the best lands probably were not returned. Anyway, so this is kind of the background that's going on here. And in the 1840s, the Seneca Nation itself had its own turmoil. So the Seneca Nation, what's called the Seneca Nation today, left the Confederacy. 1848, we had an elective revolution. Decided to move away from the tribal chief system Confederacy with all the other nations, you know, Mohawks, Oneidas, Cayugas, Onondagas, and Tuscaroras. Then we went to an elective system, just like in the United States. So technically, since 1848, my nation, because I'm a member of the Seneca Nation, Allegheny Territory, we're not part of the Confederacy. The title, Keeper of the Western Door, well, our ancestors were, and today, Tonawanda is, for the Confederacy, Keeper of the Western Door. Tonawanda is still part of the Confederacy. They have their chiefs, and they maintain their system, and they are Keepers of the Western Door. Now you'll see if you come to the Allegheny Territory near Salamanca, you'll see signs, Keepers of the Western Door, and that's about our history. You know, joint history had, so, you know, kind of went like this. So, there's a lot of things that have happened in between that kind of affect relations within the nations and as well with the state, of course, and the United States. Historically, Oil Springs was not a permanent residence for us. What it was is a meeting place, a stopover place, someplace we hunted. We went to the spring, gathered oil. But it wasn't like Allegheny, Cattaraugus, and Allegheny came later. It wasn't like Cattaraugus. It was more like Buffalo Creek. It wasn't like Buffalo Creek and the villages and everything that you may know about in the Genesee Valley. But it was our property in the sense of how Indians controlled land. And historically, of course, Indians didn't feel they owned land with a title and a deed until you get into the 1800s and this long period of interaction with the United States. European Americans, because that system came from Europe, of course. So now, you know, having surveyors out there making lines and maps, and you know, you own this, and you know, you can't take my apples from here anymore, right? If it's over the line, you know, we weren't like that. And you know, before Europeans came over, I'm sure there was some conflict over economic resources, hunting, game, fishing. You know, I believe there was enough to go around. And it wasn't hoarded. It wasn't sold for a profit. Maybe it was a barter. You know, maybe it was just simply enough for people to survive, regardless of what nation they were. Regardless, after this 1848 revolution, our relationships with the Confederacy ends, but we still maintain a tradition. And that tradition before we left the Confederacy and after we created the elective system in 1848 is we always kept a caretaker at Oil Springs, protect our territory. Okay, it's a tradition that still exists today, we agree. You get to the mid-1850s, now what's happening near the Allegheny Territory is the railroads are coming in. Why are the railroads coming in? Capitalism, money, right? Where do you build railroads? Through the valleys, by the rivers. Where do indigenous people throughout the world live? In the valleys, near the rivers. Why the rivers? Food, animals, you know, it's just the system Mother Earth gave us, right? So, again, part of that challenge for entrepreneurs is to get the natives out of there, build the railroads, be able to use the water for for your steam engines, be able to create towns of workers to load and unload trains, put produce on, move it out to the Great Lakes. Again, Erie Canal becomes the next level of that, right? It's the same process. So now we have more pressure for not just Oil Springs, but the Allegheny Territory. And it's kind of unique because this little community was created called Salamanca. And Salamanca was never land bought from the Holland Land Company. In fact, it was never land purchased. It was wood squatters. I mean, there were squatters everywhere, not just Salamanca, right? But there were leases. And that's not part of today's topic, but leasing occurred. And leasing occurred because it was timber, Then there became oil. There was an oil rush, right? Mid-19th century, we have the oil rush. So, where the Senecas lived was valuable. Valuable to the growth of the United States. In fact, it was a major part of the economic growth of the United States. So now, historic presence of oil at Oil Springs. We have the oil rush, Pennsylvania, Titusville. So what's going to happen? Investors are going to come in. And right away after Titusville, this fellow comes in, he purchases all the leasing rights to oil on all of the Seneca Nation territories. Not just Oil Springs. Let's get Allegheny, Cattaraugus too, right? So that did occur.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Who was doing it? Were the tribe, was the Seneca Nation giving them the lease? Or
Excellent question. Look, I'll spend a couple minutes on that. So we got squatters, no rights. Just came in, set up a place, did what they did, right?
were they European Americans?
Oh, yeah. Squatters were natives. Then we had individual Senecas leasing land. They weren't supposed to be leasing land. The nation was supposed to lease the land. So now you get illegal leases, okay? And the Seneca Nation did approve some leases. So you have this quagmire, this mix of leases. Legal, some illegal. But generally they're all illegal in the sense that the federal government needed to be there, just like the treaties, and trust responsibility, if you ever heard about that, to approve these. And that did not occur. Seneca grew really fast, became a very important economic cog. Railroads came through, waterways were there, taking stuff out to the Great Lakes, you know. Seneca boomed, it was a booming place. We're not a booming place anymore. We're like, you see Western New York town, some of them, the old factories, some of the wood factories are gone, and you know, it's kind of, houses don't look as great as they used to, and so, you know, the economy's changed, but there was a moment that Seneca was a very important time. So, federal government did not come in and slap up New York State and say, these leases and these things that you've done in legislation are not legal. They didn't come and say, get out. That didn't happen. In fact, Seneca had two congressmen, little old Seneca, had congressmen, federal government. And, you know, that, again, not part of Oil Springs today, but they actually promoted legislation in New York State and the federal government to allow our lands. Why? Infrastructure for American economy. Kind of a logical process that happens, not just to the Senecas, throughout the whole world. This is how it happens in the whole world. I'm not the great expert on it, but it's a process, right? So, a lot of that's going on. Let's go back to the 1850s, back to Oil Springs. So we have all these dynamic things happening out there, right? In the mid-1850s, the United States Indian agent named Daniel Sherman, he filed a suit for recovery of land that was taken for creation of Oil Springs. Well, squatters were building cottages at Oil Springs. So that occurred, squatting occurred there. And of course the nation didn't approve it. Maybe the state had some form of approval, but it wasn't legal. So by 1856, the Indian agent from the United States government supports legal claim to get the land back and deal with the squatters. Now these squatters, again, just as I said before, they were looking for mineral rights, oil, and timber. Timber, by the way, timber was very important. A lot of timber. We still have a lot of timber. You know, the river was the passageway for timber. You know, they used the Allegheny River. You know, there's books on how all the timber went down to Pittsburgh. People would take them down and come back up. It was quite an industry. So it's all part of that infrastructure. So there was this guy named Philonis Pattison. Okay, there are 3 defendants in this important case. For the Seneca, this is an important case, right? Because they're defending their rights for Oil Springs territory. He bought land from, where did he buy land from? Holland Land Company. Okay, Holland Land Company well, they thought they did. Okay, they thought they did. Wasn't an original map. No story. So, another firm, Seymour, Gallagher, Chamberlain, and Clark, said they owned 160 acres. And there was this guy Seymour. He became an individual defendant. He was a canal promoter. He was actually quite a very powerful person. He became the governor of New York State. Ran for president of the United States in 1868. He was part of this case. Senecas came and they testified in court. Remember, this is what year did I say? This was about 1857, 56, 7. Senecas are not citizens of the United States. So citizens have rights in the state to go to court, right? Take somebody to court. You take my land, I want to take you to court. Go see a judge and hire a lawyer and do that. Well, not that we wanted to be citizens, but we weren't. And Indians became citizens, whether they wanted it or not, in 1924. This is all really dynamic stuff going on, right? We got this growing nation. We got these growing economies and industries. We got people flocking there, some people squatting, some people buying land, erecting homes and businesses and so on, right? Railroads are flourishing. So we have this case. It's amazing this case gets into court. That's the point I'm trying to make. We're not citizens. And the federal Indian agent helps us. Okay? So these people that bought land from the Holland Land Company, they're fighting it. So we had some important chiefs. Some of the names I could share with you. Maris Pierce. We had some Indians named John Kennedy. John Kennedy Sr., Jr. And we had two Shango, William and Jackson Shango. And the fellow Jackson Shango, he was 89 years old. He didn't speak English. He was actually at the 1797 treaty, so he had an interpreter when he testified. And of course, what did the chiefs say? This is our land. We didn't give it away in 1797. We want it back. It should be ours. It's part of it's been stolen, right? Been infringed upon. Cottages, and industry. And actually, Senecas win this case. Which is incredible, because at that very same time, this is when the Tonawanda Nation has their victory to repurchase their land. Okay? So, I'd like to be able to explain exactly how that all occurred in history, but it's rather unique. This is a time when Indians are not winning these kind of cases. Yeah, we didn't win all our cases. These are probably some of the few exceptions. So, Governor Blacksnake, the nephew of Hanson Lake, who inherited the map, was the protector of that. He testified. I'd like to just his testimony part of it. And he was over 100 years old. He says, I live at Cold Spring, that's at Allegheny. And I lived there, or not far from there, 70 years. He was actually born in Genesee Valley. I'm 107 years old. I've been a chief of the Seneca Nation since the Revolutionary War. I've been on the Oil Spring territory before the treaty with Robert Morris often, before the treaty. The Senecas used to go there, make a long stay, and hunt, just the same as before. They had a council on the Genesee River and made the Oil Springs Reservation a stopping place. between there and the Allegheny Territory. So in each level of the legal system, he testifies this. And each time he brings in his map, Henson Lake's map, only the second copy, as proof of that. And he ends up winning the case because of this map. He kept on his bet for all these years, 60 years, almost 60 years long, basically 60 years. This is a map made by Joseph Ellicott, chief agent, Holland Land Company, namesake of Ellicottville, New York. Anybody from the Livingston County Historical Society? So I found this source. I have the source, I don't know where I found it. No, I have it in front of me. But I want to read their summary of this. Okay. So I find it interesting. Non-Indian entity writing the history as well, not just an individual historian or somebody, or a Seneca, right? So it's basically the same thing. I just want to read their version that I found. It's in the history of the Treaty of Big Tree. In 1856, the Indians began legal proceedings and ultimately succeeded in getting possession of the property. Governor Blacksnake supplied the most important evidence on the trial of the suit. He was present at the council at Big Tree. He remembered that when the treaty was read over, the omission of the Oil Springs Reservation was noticed and commented on, and that Thomas Morris executed and delivered to Handsome Lake, the prophet, a separate paper, reserving this tract to the Indians. Blacksnake also had in his possession a copy of the first map of the Holland Purchase, made by Joseph Ellicott, and presented by him. This map shows by the means of red ink the Indian reservations. So, I liked it. Some balance there, kind of nice. I don't know if I could have wrote it any better than that. New York State appealed, of course, and they actually were denied their appeal to the highest level. Okay, so now we're going to make this second stage, right? Fight for land, fight for land. Again, I talked about the oil rush, 1859, right? Titusville. It was a worldwide thing, you know, for at least North America, right? Mother Earth. Edwin Drake has the first successful oil well. The fellow I was talking about before is Colonel Bradford H. Alden. Goes to the Seneca Nation. He leases the mineral rights for Allegheny and Oil Springs. At the time, it's the largest lease ever granted for oil exploration in the state of New York, 1859. It's a 20-year lease, so it had 1/3 royalty for the Seneca Nation. I have no idea about the money. It came in, what happened to it. I wish I could tell you that, I can't. But interesting.
You said 1/3?
1/3. Yeah. So Governor Blacksnake, who is my great grandfather, actually, Governor Blacksnake is my great 5 times grandfather. He wins that case. The non-Indian squatters didn't immediately leave. In fact, they refused. And you know, this is the first time we face this. We're not about the Salmaker lease today, but we faced the same situation after the same process of the leases. Same story kind of went through. Not until 1861, New York State, at the Court of Appeals, finally, Seneca Nation versus Addison again. Eventually they are removed, but they didn't go willingly. So now we're moving into the economic era. So a dam was created, and Cuba Lake was created. Cuba Lake becomes the largest man-made lake in the United States. Part of the Erie Canal process, the same process for economy, moving things, right? Transporting have transportation. But beyond that, it becomes recreation. When we make a lake, what's our recreation?
Fishing.
Boating, fishing, cottages, renting them, right? So that's happening. Well, when New York State did this, now let me say that Cuba Lake wasn't entirely on the Seneca Nation, okay? It was just a portion. New York State made its legislative process and it took land to create Cuba Lake. However, it took some Seneca Nation land. And this is what we end up contesting, okay, as it goes in time. So I don't want to stand up here and give you the impression they took the whole thing. So the lake was mostly on New York State. I don't know the exact acreage, but they took 45 acres of the Oil Springs territory. New York State did. Again, the 1791 Air Course Act says you can't take any Indian land, states, if you don't get what? Federal approval, right? And the House or Senate. The Senate has to support or ratify it, right? So again, this didn't happen. New York State took 47 acres and they made a reservoir, a lake. And they said they made somewhere, I think it's a 45-foot dam. Now, when I went there, I didn't see a 45-foot dam. I'm not sure it exists anymore. I don't know that history, to be honest. So I created this whole new economic entity. Transportation, recreation. Now the American economy is increasing, right? In 1863, 1868, New York State starts raising the level of the water. Again, they're doing that for the Erie Canal. The more they did that, the more it came onto some of the land. Okay? I suspect it wasn't intentional in that sense. I suspect they're not sitting in New York saying, let's flood the Seneca land and it'll become ours. Okay? But they just were functional. Made a lake, needed water for a canal, right? It was going to help. That didn't actually, the plan didn't actually work with the Erie Canal in the end. New York State paid the attorney for the Seneca Nation $1,319 in 1866 for the land that was taken. Again, no federal approval. In the end, by American law, it's illegal. Sound like a broken record. Sorry. 1872, again, now raising the lake 5 more feet. By 1878, the canal project is done. Genesee Valley Canal. Move into 1900s. Moving into, well, it's always been sovereignty, okay? It's always been sovereignty, but now it becomes more of a sovereignty issue. Seneca's fighting New York State, sovereign control over their land, all right? Land is left. Just be clear about that. We had treaties approved by the government, sold land here, right? Holland Land Company purchased buildings on it, right? (1913). We have this nice lake. It's an economic attractor to Western New York. New York State legislation passes its own laws that says we are taking control of the conservation of Cuba Lake, including the Seneca Nation portion. They don't spell out that way in legislation, they just say Cuba Lake, right? But that's what's happening. Now another infringement on sovereignty from the viewpoint of the Seneca people. Cuba Lake is now stocked with, I like reading all the fish because I was a lifelong fisherman. I don't fish anymore, but largemouth, smallmouth, rock bass, bluegill, brown bullheads, common carp, yellow perch, northern pike, pumpkin seeds, white suckers and walleye. I've caught every one of those once in my life, right? But they stock Cuba Lake, okay? What happens when you stock, state stocks a lake and somebody wants to come fish?
Gotta pay the state.
Yeah, you gotta buy a license. And now that's what we moved into, okay? Moved in a little more sovereignty challenges. New York State starts selling licenses, claiming the right to control that. The Seneca's feel they, are left out of that process. And through the 1920s, this battle occurs. By 1927, there's federal legislation that gives concurrent jurisdiction. So the Senecas can sell licenses, but the Senecas have to have a license. And before that, the state was imposing on Senecas on their land to buy a license for boating. Get their license for a boat too, right? Can't just, they're supposed to drive on those lands with certain dimensions of boats, right? So this sovereignty issue is working its way through, and our president at the time, Willie Ho, was a very progressive president. He's the greatest elected president we had. He served, I don't remember the number, 13 terms maybe? So, he ruled for 2.5 decades, almost 3 decades till his death. So he lost maybe once or twice from 1892 to 1927. Lost a couple times, but he was the power baron, and he interacted with the Indian elites, Seneca elites. Remember I told you some of those people were congressmen, state legislators, state congressmen, right? One fellow I published an article on him. He was probably the very powerful New York State official. Anyways, you can see what's happening in the Seneca background. Think about this. Concurrent jurisdiction. New York State and the Senecas can have licenses and policing, whatever word you want to use for that, conservation. You can see some people not being happy with that development. You can see other people happy with that development because it was taken away. So, the dynamics of that is, Indians like to say we have solidarity and we're one for all, but the reality of humans is a little more complicated than that, of course. So these are troubling times. Troubling times. We're still fighting for sovereignty. It's a different process, but we're fighting for sovereignty. This little 1 square acre, Cuba Lake. First, it's the resource, spiritual thing, right? Then it becomes an economic resource. Then it becomes a new form of resource, right? Recreation. Do we have alligators? Do we have parks all over New York State? Part of our important marketing economy? Yeah, right? So, Cuba Lake, Oil Springs goes all through this. All through this. It's growing and all these issues are being challenged and trying to be figured out, right? So, 1924, Senecas filed a complaint to New York State that land taken for canal purposes is now owned by private owners. Okay, people that live cottages. New York State, and by the way, New York State is leasing that to them, and New York State is taking the lease money. And in these suits, we're not asking about the cottages that are on New York State land, okay? We're not asking that. I don't want to portray that we are. Just our part. Our part.
Is that a legal battle that's still pending?
End of the story will be good for the Senecas. It's over by the time we get to this century. A couple pages from here.
Close.
No, don't be sorry. That's a great question. Because that's what I'm leading up to. This is the early part of it. In 1914, the state forester said, hey, we've got something going on in Cuba. It's going to be a problem with the Indians. Okay, so he's seeing it coming, right? So we've always had this power struggle with the state, federal government, Seneca Nation. in the Senate, because we conflicted more with New York State than federal government, because New York State has been had more interest in getting land or resources, anything, criminal, civil jurisdiction, you name it. Because we're neighbors. Neighbors fight for things like that, right? So, what did I say? 1924, formal complaint. Nothing happened. New York State, they do not have claims. Go to about 1927, Federal Act, concurrent jurisdiction. You know, I hate about that. If I'd be dreaming, no. If I'm somewhere in the middle, well, we got some of it, we kept some of it. Does that mean don't fight for all of it? Me personally, I say fight for all of it. Anyways, doesn't matter what my opinion is, okay? It's what's going on. Okay. It's a seesaw thing, right? You know, politics, the court systems, you know, it's about personalities of people and power groups and people who are influencing other people, you know, so. Politics. There was no federal hearing on this legislation. Remember, there are people, in 1927, there are people mad about 1924. What I say happened in 1924? The United States government made all Indian citizens. Right? Made them. Didn't say, choose yes or no. Right? Again, the fear of becoming a citizen, I pay taxes on my land, because native land is not taxable. I admit to you that I don't pay taxes to the city of Seneca, because it's the Allegheny Territory. I'm a member of the Seneca Nation. Seneca Nation owns the land. New York State is not allowed to tax my land. If I work on the territory, New York State is not allowed to tax my income. However, federal government does. Taxes everything they can. You know, we talk about the Indian gas stations, I'm not expert at, but they're paying the federal tax. Well, the ones that are doing that, maybe there's something art that I don't know about. But when that oil comes in or that gas comes in, federal tax is paid to the United States. Okay, so we say tax-free, that only means no New York State. That's what it means. That's really what it means. So now why New York State's fighting, right? There's a lot of money, right? Cigarettes, other products, gasoline. Anyway, these are the issues we as a Seneca Nation face. It's not something we just alleviate at one point and not deal with it anymore. It's a constant battle. So I told you about concurrent jurisdiction. So 1928. Now we move back to the land. Those leases I was telling you about that were legal. Now there's activity. The United States government doesn't help us. They approved a deed of conveyance of certain leases to non-Indians living on the Oil Springs territory. So, okay, push, pull, you know, little wind, fall back a little in this area. It's the way the world works. So that's 1928. I already jumped to the 1930s, but you know, Cuba Lake becomes very popular. Retirees and second homeowners, they want a vacation there. It's pretty, it's nice. There was a racetrack there. I don't know about that, I don't remember that. A skating rink, pavilion for entertainment, of course a restaurant for people to socialize, eat, drink, be merry, be happy, right? And there's this, I guess it's a historic amusement park. It's called Olive Crest Amusement Park. I only know about it by reading about it. And it has been reassembled. It's in the New York State Museum. And it was at Cuba Lake. So they built this economy. You know, they had summer economy. People came, they leased, they rented. Some people built homes. They stayed there, they boated, they fished. You know, just the ideal people think about in the summertime. You know, we're moving to that. You know, we're gonna go to camp, right? We're gonna go to the lake. These are the things we dream about, right? For fun, recreation, outside of work. Cuba Lake became this in the 1930s. Again, the Seneca is still working in the 1930s to battle the injustices. And the former New York State Governor, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, squashes any legislation that allows us to get any adulating to fighting for the return of our property. 1970s, there's a change in legal system, in I guess the history of the Supreme Court. Indians now, with the United case, could get into the Supreme Court, into the legal system, and fight for land claims. We could not before. Okay. So now, Senecas are thinking again, Cuba Lake. Let's go after Cuba Lake again. In 1985, Seneca Nation filed legal action against the state of New York in federal court of Buffalo for the return of lands taken Cuba Lake from 1858 to 1872. The water coming up, Cuba Lake. 1993, they added the individual lessees of the cottages at Cuba Lake as defendants. So now it's not just the land, now it's the cottages. In 1994, Seneca Nation opens a gas station on their property, our property. A convenience store. Starts selling cigarettes without New York State tax. So the battle rages on, right? And so the battle rages on, so these things are happening. 1994. 1998, 1999, as this battle goes on, the United States Department of Justice enters the case, again, from the side of the Senecas. And this is the beginning of victory for us, as you would imagine, asking. So, in 2002, we win the case. 2002, the court system appointed a mediator. It's hard to give everything back after a long period of time. Legal systems try to mediate things, arbitration. This fellow, Louis Coffey. So for 3 years, Seneca Nation has a land claim committee headed by my friend Arlene Beauvais, tribal counselor, and a Seneca Nation attorney. And they negotiated with New York State. They came to an agreement. This is the first New York State land agreement with an Indian nation. And then we did get our land back, control of our land. Those illegal squatters, those illegal leases, and those cottages, if the state built them, if the person built them, those people had to leave. They weren't happy. I don't blame them for not being happy. We weren't happy to begin with when they were there. But it took a long time, but we win this case. In 2014, Seneca Nation opened Seneca Gaming and Entertainment, Class 2 gaming facility, Cuba Lake. So we kind of come full circle. Been a long fight. We didn't lose in the end. We lost for a long time during the process. This is a short history. This is a landmark decision. I can't really say, compared to other Native nations, that they've had this process and they've gone this long and have won. And the Senecas, just so you understand, our sovereignty is different than some of the other most of the Indian nations in the land. Most of the Indian nations were subject to the Indian Reorganization Act, subject to the power of the Bureau of Indian Affairs down here, Bureau of Indian Affairs down here. We're not. Federal government, we have treaties, equal treaties. New York State down here. Federal government has to prove anything in New York State with us, right? New York State tried to put us down here. They did for a while, right? We've heard this story. They did. They were able to push us around and get what they wanted. And we were lucky. So all I can say is we were lucky. I don't know why, but we were lucky. And that's the end of my brief history of Oil Springs territory. Donnie home. Questions? You have questions?
Is that where Red Jacket got his black eye, was Was he involved in the Buffalo Creek Treaty and representing himself? Some of the Senecas argued that he wasn't a real chief, but he was negotiating as well.
Big treaty, 1797. And they were, actually, when you look at the actual treaties, there were Corn Planter, who was the uncle of Black Snake, their brother of Handsome Lake. A number of those leaders got annuities, direct cash payments to them as part of the negotiations. So hanging out with Thomas Morris, Robert Morris, things happened. So indeed, yes. So the politics of the day, you know, different form, different, same process. We had some leaders get some, right? We got people to this day say, look at those names, look at them. They took money, some nations, you know. you can understand that perspective. But yes. The Red Jacket was not a chief, he was a sub-chief, but he was a fantastic orator. And, you know, he was a defender of the Seneca Nation. He was a defender of our spiritual life. He was not a supporter of Christianity. He battled Christianity all the way. I've actually just published a book about the origin of Christian missions. It's not a book that's just totally talking about the negative effects of the Indian schools. I have some footnotes to talk about that, but it's on my list on the sheet there. I just published that book last winter. So, but his life, him and Black Snake, they were against Christianity. Corn Planter is the prophet's brother. He brought in the Quakers. He brought them in for training. Didn't necessarily, at the first invitation, say, convert us to Christianity. We need to leave our pagan ways, right? He didn't say that. But he was a bit progressive and wanted the children to be able to read and write, be able to deal with neighbors. And the Quakers are part of the process. Summarize that in one recent book. There are atrocities out there for, you know, the Indian schools. Our people experience that. Not the only ones in the world, but it's a painful thing for us. Any other questions?
So there's a casino on Cuba Lake now?
Yeah. Little gaming facility. Necessarily, you can call it a casino. It's a very small building, maybe as big as this building.
Yeah.
It's not a federal casino. It's a level 2. There are technical differences. The casino in Allegheny, Niagara Falls. It's not like those. There's no hotel. It's not that big. It's a building you come into and you can take your chances and only take one you can lose. I suggest.
Is there still a separation between the Senecas? You mentioned that they separated in 1848, or I think that was the date.
Well, it's a good question. In the 1860s, we actually had the old chiefs had a party in the elective system. First, they wouldn't participate in the traditionals, and then they won in like 1861, 62, and then they passed tribal laws to go back to the Confederacy. Big fight. Didn't happen. Now our system politically for the Seneca Nation is elective. Well, but there's, you know, the cultural issues for traditional belief systems and spirituality is still strong. And Cold Spring is the place where, like for example, I'll take my grandson to the Longhouse tomorrow. It's our strawberry festival. It's one of our annual festivals. He's 3, so I'm trying to, you know, expose him. He's been learning how to sing and do a little drumming. Things he doesn't know how valuable they are yet to keeping our culture going. But there's always political difference, but we haven't had a revolution to go back to the Confederacy. Can you find a person who will say that? Sure. Is it the majority? Not really. Am I saying the elective system is the best? I'm not saying that, but it's what we have. We have one strong party. It's kind of a one-party system. If you win, you know, if you win the primary, you're going to be elected pretty much. Seneca Party. So, good question. Now, Tonawanda is a Seneca Nation, there's your difference. Still there.
I thought.
Still there. They're, they insist on not taking federal funds. I don't want to paraphrase them, because I don't want to be wrong when I say that, but my belief is that they feel they shouldn't take federal funds to maintain their full sovereignty. We take federal funds. So that becomes a point of contention. That's an excellent question for the state of affairs.
Thank you.
You're welcome, yeah. Well, thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you again, Randy, for coming out and sharing the history of our area that I think is very eye-opening and enlightening in many respects. Growing up in the southern tier, I always heard about Oil Springs, but now I know a whole lot more. So thank you everyone for coming tonight. Just a few upcoming things. On Saturday is our New York State Path Through History weekend event. We are doing a stroll along the History Trail at the Genesee County Park and Forest down in Bethany. We have about 20 different reenactors coming, as well as some special hikes that the county park's doing, musket and cannon demonstrations. From 11 to 3, there's food trucks. It's a whole big event, so if you can make it down, come down for that. And then to finish off June, next Wednesday is our next guest speaker, Joyce Thompson-Hovey, will be talking about the martyr and the traitor, about 2 American spies during the Revolutionary War with some local connections. And then Thursday we have a double dipper. We have Jabba with Joe at 9 a.m. Tyler Angora, who is at the Leroy Historical Society, will be talking about Ingham University. And then at 7 p.m. we have another guest speaker, Vic Vignola, who will be talking about the Battle of Seven Pines. So still a lot happening in June. And then we will be moving on to July, which will be interesting here. So, so thank you everybody. I hope to see you out and have a great night.
Thank you.